SC Media and our sponsor, Sneak, are proud to present this month's CISO Stories program. This is the show where CISOs share tales from the trenches and unpack leadership lessons learned along the way. Find this month's CISO Stories content at CISOstoriespodcast.com. Are you a cyber professional who enjoys writing policy documents, or building checklists, or creating documents from scratch? Do you have endless amounts of time and money to focus on developing tools and templates, or would you rather do the work of protecting your organization? The Cyber Risk Collaborative has developed new resource toolkits, which are CISO-developed and topic-curated guidance, tools, and templates to save your team tens of thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours of work. Visit CISOstoriespodcast.com/CRC to sign up for the community and get your toolkits. Greetings, everyone. Welcome back for another month's episode of CISO Stories Podcast. We have another special, distinguished guest, Danielle Ruderman. Don't get it twisted. She's very pleasant, okay. So thank you so much for joining us today. Our theme this month is AppSec and DevSecOps. I know you do a lot in the community. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hey, everyone. And Jess, thank you so much for having me on today. So yes, I work for AWS, and I've been here since 2016, so a good long time. And a big part of what I do, I lead a team of global security specialists, and we help enable customers to use AWS. And a big part of what we do is community building, right? And so we work with CISOs around the world. We have a program called CISO Circles. We're in about 30 countries. And it's been a great opportunity for AWS to learn from our customers. Customer obsession is a big thing at Amazon. And so this is just one of the many ways that we learn from our customers. And it's really helped us reinforce that idea. Security really is a top priority for us. And this is a way for our customers to hear directly from our leaders in security and our service teams. And I think the benefit for us is we've learned so much about the security priorities for CISOs all around the world. And I know that the theme this month, DevSecOps and AppSec, absolutely critical to the security teams, right? How we develop those relationships with our development teams and our service teams. So excited to hear and share some of that with you today.
Yes, absolutely. I feel like you probably have the coolest job ever. You get to travel around and talk to CISOs globally that are AWS clients, and then take that feedback and use it to make the product even better. So that's really, really cool. What are some of the trends that you're seeing maybe this past year related to DevSecOps and app security?
Right. Yeah, it's been a consistent top 5 topic for us all around the world. And, if you think about security, right, where people, process, and technology, I think a lot of the CISOs feel that they have the technology piece. That's one aspect of it. But then people and process is honestly, over the years, what we hear the most about. And it's how can we develop the relationships we need with our developers, right, to help them think about security in the right way. And so that's really what we spend a lot of time in our conversations is the people and process side. And at AWS, right, security is our top priority. It's been that way since day one for us. And so we try to take the lessons that we have from how we do security at AWS and the relationships we have with our service teams, and what lessons can you extract from that other teams can learn from, right? And so that's been a big part of what we talk about.
Awesome. Yeah, I bet there's a wide range of topics there. Do you see any differences across the globe as far as the way that attacking the cultural changes when it comes just to security in general? Do you see any differences there? And how do you see other practitioners really gauging that? Because, we were just talking how, technology is technology, but it's really about the culture and how we interact with the technology, how we, maintain the technology and continue to do so. So can you speak a little bit about that from a cultural perspective?
Sure. So a lot of our customers are global companies, right? And so you have to think about the personalities and the cultural norms in the different countries that you're working in. And so you might be operating in a country where it's not common for people to feel comfortable speaking up. And so if you want to think about that idea of instilling a sense of psychological safety in your development teams, you might have to approach it differently than in a culture where people are more open, right? And they're willing to bring up issues or challenge authority or something like that. And so having that level of cultural sensitivity is very important, and understanding developers in different countries may have different reasons that they do or do not feel comfortable speaking up. And so that's definitely something to pay attention to.
Yeah, I agree. A long, long time ago, I was a developer, and security wasn't necessarily what I was thinking about. I was just trying to
Right.
get the code out, right? Getting out to, QA and eventually to production. I think times has changed a lot since then. The tools that we have, AWS has tremendous wealth of products and services to really help with that and integrate security, baking it in instead of baking it on, of course. So that's really interesting that, again, got a super dope job you have there talking to so many different people. I imagine you get a lot of different feedback, like you said, from a cultural perspective. When we talked the other day, you mentioned you had like a tiered approach for how you would tackle changing the culture and maintaining that really and instilling it to where everybody's excited about security. I get excited about security. I think just walk in the room and just like, yeah, let's get excited.
Right.
So what tactics do you have to really drill that home?
Yeah, we think about security kind of in three different ingredients that you need to have a good culture. And the first thing I want to point out is that at Amazon, we're very deliberate when we talk about shifting that culture, right? We call it a culture of security because our concept is that security belongs to everyone in the company, not just the security team. Whereas when you say security culture, you're speaking about the culture of your security team, right? Which is a very important topic as well, right? But culture of security is that idea that, hey, how are we, the security team, thinking about working with others in the company to instill that mindset? And so there's three main ingredients there, right? There's this idea of executive support that from the very top of the company, you, the security team, feel that security is a top priority, right? The second thing is this idea of distributed ownership. So that's how the mechanisms we have to federate security out into the rest of the organization, especially into our product teams. And then the last one is this idea of psychological safety, which I mentioned earlier, right? It doesn't do any good to have all of these mechanisms if people in your company don't, number one, feel comfortable speaking up. And number two, that they trust that you will do something about the issues that they raise, right? So three very important different ingredients here.
Yeah, if we take it from the top, that executive support, I know personally, firsthand experience is very, very critical. I have friends in the field who actually left CISO positions or leadership positions in security because they didn't have that buy-in, whether it's just that somebody having their back to
Right.
having the budget. So yeah, that's really interesting. How from the CISO circle that you lead, again, I'm like, I have a million questions. What do you do? Where do you meet? What do you talk about? What do you wear? Where do you go? But yeah, that executive support, I imagine there's CISOs that are in part of this group. So what kind of leadership are they looking for when it comes to executive support?
Yeah, one of the interesting things, I know that Amazon, our CEO has been very vocal about how security is our top priority. Not all companies have that level of support. And so it's been interesting to open up that conversation in the circles because we do them under NDA. So CISOs can feel comfortable kind of really getting into it. And one of the things they've raised is if you're trying to gain that executive leadership, a good thing to do is just reach out to each other. One CISO said that every time he takes on a new CISO role, he looks at who's in the board of directors and who's in the leadership team, and he tries to find out what other boards they're on, right? Where else do they work? So that he can call up the CISOs at those companies and get advice, right? That's something you might not think about doing. Because if you're trying to instill this culture of security or work better with your developers, it's so much easier if you get that support from the top. And so reaching out to folks who know your board, know your audit committee members, and finding out, what kind of metrics do they care about, right? What's going to drive the needle? What kind of questions do they ask? And to really develop that relationship and an understanding of the people in power in your organization so you can try to change their mindset with the hope that they'll eventually, from the top, right, send that mandate down throughout the company that we do care about security and we're willing to do something about it.
And that goes into your second point about distributed ownership. So you mentioned metrics as well. What kind of metrics do you see that these CISOs, these leaders, are really using to gauge the success of that?
Yeah, this is a question we often ask if CISOs are having challenges getting development teams to pay attention to security. We ask them, well, what do you measure when it comes to security, right? Are you measuring things today? Because sometimes they're not. And then we ask them to think about what types of things you could measure. We have some CISOs who like to measure the concept of developer velocity, right? How quickly developers are able to push code to production. At AWS, there are two key measures we have for our developers when it comes to security. Number one is the number of medium to high severity findings that end up in the final AppSec review. And then number two, how quickly we can get through the AppSec review, right? How much time it takes. And so by tracking those two metrics, we're able to modify our systems to get those, improve those numbers so we can go back to the business and say, hey, if you work with the security team and follow our recommendations, we can actually demonstrate that we can have, for us, it's about 24% fewer medium to high severity findings and about 27% faster through the review cycle. So these are really key metrics to have. So we encourage CISOs to discuss amongst themselves, like, what are the kind of things you could track? And once you've got a baseline, then you can start making changes and start running pilot programs. Because I think sometimes it can feel overwhelming to how can we change this distributed ownership culture. And so I have a couple pieces of advice there. We have something called a Security Champions and Guardians program. So maybe you've heard about something like that. They're popular these days.
Yes.
Yes. So I like to let everyone know, like the Guardian program at Amazon, right? This is this idea where the AppSec team is going to train the developers in the product teams to understand security, right? For us, we teach them how to bar raise a threat model and how to understand the basics of security so that when they're in the ideation phase of product building, they don't make mistakes that can be very costly later on, right? There's lessons that you can teach dev teams to think about really early on in the product. Those are two really key items. And ours started out as an experiment, right? This idea of a Guardians program. So two of our AppSec engineers realized that there was no way the AppSec team could grow at the same velocity as our service teams. And I think this is a common concern. You know, you probably have felt this pain in your roles as well, right? We can never hire enough security professionals, especially to keep up with the developer velocity. And so the AppSec folks said, what if we trained some of our friendly developers how to do security better so that they could take some of those learnings and instill them in their developer culture, right? And so for us, it just started as an experiment. Like I said, two AppSec engineers came up with this idea, and they worked with the friendly folks that they knew. And that's another piece of advice we share with our CISOs is look for the personalities in your organization, in your development teams that are open to being experimental, right? You know those folks. They're curious, they're interested, they're willing to try things. And once you figure it out with those folks, they tend to turn the tide for the others who are more of the fence sitters or the detractors. And so by doing that, we started this pilot program. And the Guardian program actually grew like wildfire on its own because the developers started telling their peers on the other teams how great it was to go faster through the AppSec review and have fewer issues. Like they didn't have to go back and fix as many things once they got it right. And so we ended up with a Guardians program that grew organically on its own. And we had to go back. It actually became a part of a challenge, right? It's hard to manage. So we had to go back and bring in technical program managers, or TPMs, to manage the program and start creating community around the Guardians. And so that's a big piece of advice we give. If you're thinking about doing something like this, right, trying to embrace the developers and give them more resources, think about this idea of community, right? Because you want to give them training, exposure, recognition from executives. Like there's a whole lot that goes into that. But the lesson here is that do a pilot, right? It can be a small experiment until you figure it out, and then you can scale it to additional teams in your developer organization.
I love that. I feel like we're similar to the medical field. We got to experiment, right? We just got to experiment, see how things go. But having cyber champions out there in the workforce, even folks that aren't even IT, right? Just having them really, I like to say, just say, get excited about security, but understand the basics, like you said. And from a development perspective, you were spot on, right? It's all about getting the product out there as quickly as possible, but without as many defects or having to go back and rework anything, because we don't want to break backward logic and all those things. So I love that you all have been doing that internally with AWS, right? And then you talk about it within your CISO circle. Have they adopted it as well? Have you seen that?
Yes, so we actually have teams in AWS who work with our customers to help them develop their own champions programs and guardians programs. And it's interesting because sometimes, depending on the organizational culture, like it's easier at some places versus others, right? And one of the things we found, this is another piece of advice, is that if you do have that internal resistance to trying something like that, just start with threat modeling. Sometimes there are developers who are willing to learn to do threat modeling. We actually publish a lot of threat modeling guidance and training that anybody can use for free. And there are a lot of developers enjoy this because if you think about it, they're the ones who know the code, right? They know what they build and ship really well. What they're missing sometimes is just that security knowledge. Whereas in application security, they know security really well, right? But they don't necessarily know the ins and outs of the service, the product, the code itself. And so you need, how do you achieve that mind share, right? And so if the developer is willing to learn a little bit about security and starting even something as simply as learning how to threat model, that really gets them the ball rolling, right? They can start learning about security, and then you start seeing them make smarter choices, right, as they're building. And that very simple step, that's something we've seen with customers be successful, to just start with the basics of threat modeling. Like I said, we have a lot of free resources on that. And once you get the ball rolling, you can start to implement additional relationships with the development team.
Yeah, that sounds like empowerment, right? You're
Yes,
empowering these. Yeah, I love it. And that you get buy-in, right? How you get somebody to care, you give them shares, you give them a
right.
stake in the game, you give them input and have them feel that their input and the work that they're doing actually
Yes.
matters, which is a good segue into your psychological aspect of a
Right.
security culture. So can you elaborate a little bit on that too?
Sure. So this idea of psychological safety, this is a big one at AWS. And like I said, there's two things that people have to feel comfortable raising an issue. And one of the ways we do that is our security team is very, very welcoming of people raising challenges. Like they say, like, if you don't know if it's an issue, it's an issue. Raise a ticket. Like we'd rather hear about something and have it not become an issue than to never hear about it at all. And so this is a really big part of our culture. This is on all of our internal wikis, on people email footers. Like if you're not sure if it's an issue, cut us a ticket. We don't care. We want to hear it all. And so it's that very welcoming, like not all security teams are like that, right? But over the years, this is what's really helped us. And I have a great story from a CISO who did something similar, right? They encouraged everyone in the company, not just the developers, to report issues. And they actually had someone from the sales team notice something amiss because they had been through the training, right? And so they reached out to the security team because, again, they felt comfortable doing it and they knew how to do it, right? And they raised this issue, and the security team actually was able to stop. There was an issue happening within the customer. They were able to get ahead of an emerging issue, right? The CISO took this example to the board of directors and said, hey, look at this. We did all this security training and it saved us a potential breach. The board then turned around and gave them more money for their champions program. So it's like, if you see the example there, it's right, entrusting your employees with security, trusting them that they'll do the right thing, give them a path to reach out to the security team, and then celebrate the wins, right? And she was very smart to take it to the board and let them know these are the kind of things that we're doing, and our company is all in, right? So that's one of my favorite examples.
And that's great. And that just is like a full circle. So being able to go to the executive board and show them, hey, look at this program. It's helping us be more efficient, reducing our resources, costs, all those things, and protecting us against the current cyber landscape. And that's where you're going to get your executive buy-in, right? So like full circle coming back around. So then they start trusting that you know what you're doing. So I love those steps that you mentioned there, because I think that a lot of executives in our field are doing that, but maybe they don't necessarily have the support, such as from AWS, being a customer of AWS. And I know, AWS is huge, right? You all are worldwide, billion-dollar company and all that, and the services that you provide. And so I do find that sometimes optimization isn't always there, right? So maybe there's customers that have AWS but don't know about these programs or don't know about the support that you're talking about right now. Could you maybe talk a little bit about those resources, a little bit more about the security culture program, Cyber Champion, and just some of the things that you just mentioned, like how can we help listeners really strengthen their team internally and leverage and optimize their AWS support?
Yeah, definitely. I think AWS, we love to create content. So we've got some really great content about culture of security, and specifically around the Guardians program I mentioned as well. We have a couple of blogs on the AWS security blog where we go into more detail about how we created the program and the kind of metrics that we track. So that's a good self-service resource for folks. We've also done some talks. I did a talk last year at Reinforce with Intuit and one of our AWS VPs about culture, which gives some additional advice and ways that both Intuit and AWS has built that culture of security and worked with developers to earn trust. And then you can always do searches on our documentation. So like our well-architected pillar has a section on application security, which has some great advice. Some of the things we talked about today, you can dive deep on our recommendations and the questions that you can ask. So online, we do have a lot of this material available for customers.
Excellent. So let's switch gears for a second. So you told us a success story that you really enjoyed. Tell us a dumpster fire story of a culture that desperately needed to change, or just a client that desperately needed all the things you just said. And like, just because we can learn from,
Right.
mistakes too, right? So tell us a juicy, dumpster fire. I like that word, story, please.
One of my favorite stories was from a CISO, and this is more good intentions gone wrong, which I think happens more than we would like, right? So the CISO wanted to introduce the security team to everybody at the company. So she and her team worked on an email to talk about all the cool things that they were working on, right? They sent it out to the entire company, and crickets. And they were like, wait, I thought people would like be all excited to learn about who we are and reach out. What the CISO realized is that she had actually scared people in the company, because when security people talk about the work that they do, sometimes they use language that might sound a little bit alarming to others. They thought their jobs were really cool and they were sharing something exciting, but the rest of the company was like, whoa, I don't know about this. And so she said, I realized the unintended consequence of the security team trying to be more transparent about our work actually put off the others in the organization. And she said, that's when I really had to think about language and communication, like how security people talk versus people outside of the security org, right? And that's another element of psychological safety, right? Thinking about the language we use. And I think security, sometimes we get a reputation for the FUD, right? The fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And so being very deliberate with language is so important. So what the CISO ended up doing is reaching out to their internal comms team and getting some help, like saying, hey, I clearly unintentionally scared everybody. Help me out here. And they were able to rework the communication and then kind of come up with a communication plan for like how to reach out to folks, how to get them the resources they need. And this is actually something we're seeing more and more, is that CISOs are figuring out that they need like internal marketing or internal comms or internal PR, if you will, and either finding consulting companies or just someone in the company who can help them to reframe the message. And you've probably seen that as well in your experience, right? The way we talk about security sometimes doesn't quite land with our intended audience. And so that's a big learning point, I will say.
Have you been following me this past month? Because I swear that just happened. And sometimes it's like we want to scare people, right? But then is that really going to get us the result that we need? And to your point, we all got to be cognizant in IT using acronyms and,
Right.
terminology that isn't necessarily understood, or, for the most part, people just won't hear it. So I think that's such a great point when we're talking about changing the culture of security and getting people excited. We got to meet them where they are and speak
Right.
their language. So that's a great example. Not dumpster fire, but we'll take it. It's fine. Well, we have a few minutes left, and I was just wondering if maybe you could share a little bit more about this CISO circle, because it sounds just so fascinating. I can imagine. I know you're bound by some secrecy here, but I can just imagine the conversations that you all are having. Are there any other trends that might be of interest to our listeners that you're seeing of late?
You'll never guess what the number one requested topic is. Come on. Try me out.
Phishing,
Come on now.
AI.
Yes, of course. Yes, Gen AI and security. So that last year and this year, it's still trending as the top requested discussion point. And that's obvious, right? I think CISOs have a dual challenge, right? They're trying to secure their organization's use of AI, because everybody and their brother and sister wants to use the tools and the coding companions. But then they also were thinking about how they can use AI themselves, right, to help their security. And so those have been some really great discussions about how to do that. And we're seeing it's great having those discussions in a closed room, because you get two mindsets, right? You have the CISOs who want to lock everything down and make sure nobody can touch any of these AI tools. But then you have the CISOs who are like, no, man, this is an amazing opportunity to earn trust with your developers. They're downloading these things and trying to access them because they want to use them, right? And so instead of blocking them, like find a way to enable them, create those walled gardens, playgrounds, whatever you want to call it, put the right guardrails in, give them a place to go so they stop, trying to do things you don't want them to do. And it's been great having those conversations, because the CISOs who are more resistant to these new emerging technologies, like AI is just part of a trend, right? We're constantly going to be changing and evolving in tech. The CISOs who have kind of that foundational technology, the foundational guardrails in place for their company, like any new technology that comes along, you're going to be able to adapt, right? They know that they need to react quickly and understand what people need. And so it's great to have those conversations so the folks who are more resistant can really start thinking about, you know what, maybe I should be doing that as well, right? Maybe there's ways that I can mitigate some of this risk because it's all about risk mitigation, right? And I think this, as these technologies evolve, it is that trust building opportunity. If you hear the business and you hear, okay, the developers want to use these coding companions, right? I'm going to create a way for them to do that. They realize the security team is there to help them. And that's just another way to earn trust with your developer community.
I've heard trust, empowerment, support, all those good things that just make us all better practitioners in general. So that's all great, great information there. Lots of gems. What would you, if you could forecast something? I know I'm putting you on your spot, but all the information that you know, all the people you talk to, all the conversations. Do you have any thoughts on the future when it comes to application security and DevOps? What we maybe should be thinking about? I know you just mentioned AI, but any variation of that? What do you think?
I think our customers are going to be looking for more, and all organizations are looking for folks to think about that's idea of secure by default. Like, what are we doing to provide tooling to developers that has some of those security basics already built in? I think that the vendors and third-party tooling out there that think about that way, they're really going to see an advantage in the market because it's a huge challenge for developers and for security teams right now. So the folks who are willing to build in the basics, like we build secure by design, that's what we do. But as we see other vendors and other partners taking on that mindset, as a security industry, we could really shift how we think about third-party risk, right? By building the foundation into some of these tools. And I think we're going to see more pressure from customers to do that.
For sure. That's a whole nother topic, third-party risk management, right? But
yes, indeed.
I think that's spot on. Yeah, I was reading some articles too about just, AI in general being a tool, a service that's going to eliminate our patching cycles, right? We're just going to be able to use that to continuous patch. So not having servers that are unpatched or out of date, that could be very soon a thing of the past, right? And it'll be replaced by some other vulnerability, of course. But I agree, secure by design. And like I said, when I was a developer 15, 20 years ago, secure, we weren't even talking about this, right? It was just about, IntelliSense at that point where you didn't have to like type out every single letter of the code or character of the code. It was, we have IntelliSense now. We don't have to think so much. But we weren't really thinking about security. At least I wasn't. So, it's really cool. And I'm not a developer by any means. Shout out to developers because I don't, that is a lot of thought process there. But I think it's really cool to see how much we've evolved when it comes to that and having like the terms AppSec and DevSecOps. So yeah, these are all great concepts and programs that you have going on. The Cyber Champions, or what did you call it again?
Security Guardians. Some customers call them champions, advisors, things like that. There's different names.
Yes, I love it. I think everybody should take that back and look at how they can incorporate that within their organization, whether it's their work or church or nonprofit. Like, it's a great, great concept. So before we end our session, I do have a ton of other questions, but that'll be for another time. Like I said, I want to know, how do I get your job? But we can talk about that later. So Danielle, I like to ask all my guests this question. What would you tell your 18-year-old self? What'd you tell Danielle when she was 18? What advice would you give her?
Related to security or just in general?
Just in general. Make it fun.
Make it fun. Travel more. I have an 18-year-old who loves being at home, and I'm like, there is a big, beautiful world out there and so much you can learn from different cultures and different people. Just get out there and hit the road and enjoy being alive because it's all too short. That's the advice I would give.
Yes. YOLO. I love that too. Well, thank you so much. Tell everybody how they can find you.
I am on LinkedIn, Danielle Ruderman, so feel free to reach out to me there. And I've done some videos on our website on Executive Insights about the CISO Circle if you want to learn more. And I just can't thank you enough. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yes, we thank you as well, Danielle, for being a guest this month and sharing all this information. I'm sure a lot of folks have never heard of the CISO Circle or some of the content and support that you mentioned that AWS has. And I think we can all agree, if you look at any URL, it's going to say AWS in there. So, we're talking real stuff here, real good advice and real good content that can really change the culture and change the way that security teams are working in the current landscape. So thank you so much, Danielle, for your time, and hope to have you back sometime. Enjoy
Absolutely.
the summer. Yeah.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you for tuning in for this month's episode of the CISO Stories podcast. We want to say a special thank you to this month's sponsor, Sneak. Visit CISOstoriesPodcast.com/Sneak to learn more. Please subscribe to the CISO Stories podcast and you will receive a new episode on the second Monday of each month.